Welcome to the Change Life Destiny podcast, where healthcare is being reimagined one conversation at a time. We spotlight the people, innovations, and ideas moving us from sick care to self-care and from reactivity to true prevention. A place to connect, learn, and build a new future together. Get inspired at changelifedestiny.com. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Change Life Destiny podcast series. I'm your host, Stephanie, and today I am here with Darryl Bosshardt from Redmond Salt. Welcome to the podcast, Darryl.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm so excited to be here today. Some people think that salt is mundane or boring, but hopefully when we're done here today, the audience will see that salt's pretty amazing.
I love it. I love it. I know that I have your salt in my pantry right now. So I'm very excited to learn even more than I already knew about it. So before we get to the salt, let's just talk about you a little bit, Darryl. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself working for Redmond Salt.
So I grew up in a little town in Utah called Redmond, and it's named after these three red mounds that are behind the town. It's where the name Red Mound or Redmond came from. And
Gotcha.
so back in the 1950s, my grandfather and his brother had a farm just north of town that serendipitously had a salt deposit under it. And so in the 1950s, my grandfather and great uncle, their farm was struggling because of a drought in the area, and they knew there was salt under their farm. And so, with my grandfather's experience in business from working in California during World War II, and his brother's experience at working at a mine called Kennecott Copper, the big copper mine in Utah, after the war, they came back to raise their families on their dad's farm. And it just so happened that underneath that farm was this massive deposit of salt that they went into business and started selling in the 1950s, mostly for livestock and for cows and to keep roads safe because salt can do all of that. And then in the 1970s, moved into the food salt side of the business. And then I was just grew up in the salt business.
And so there's enough salt there for all this time. That's fascinating to me. Fascinating to me. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is a family affair.
Yeah, growing up, my dad would say, "Hey, if you don't straighten up, I'm going to send you to the salt mines." And he wasn't kidding. No, just kidding. But yeah, I got to grow up in a salt mine, which was fun and unique. And not all the family's still involved, but a lot of us are. And it's not just my family anymore, it's a lot larger group. It's still privately held. But yeah, a fun family history side of salt.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about this deposit. Like, how big are we talking?
So you mentioned earlier about how many years left or how many years of salt. Geologists and our mine engineers suggest we probably have about 900 years worth of salt left at current operations.
Whoa.
So we can certainly salt your food liberally and add it to your water, which is a healthy practice to do without any concern. The deposit itself is about a quarter mile wide and about 3 miles long and about 5,000 feet deep. And
Wow.
so this deposit is massive. Geologists tell us that Utah was about 50 miles wider apart eons ago. And if you've been to Utah, you'll see these mountain ranges that all run north and south because it's been buckled and these ranges have been pushed up. So,
Hmm.
as this ancient sea, which geologists placed during the Jurassic era, it was called the Sundance Sea. The Arctic Ocean flooded down through Canada and left this massive body of salt water eons ago. I wasn't alive back then to confirm the actual date, but it was during the late Jurassic era, which geologists put 150 million years ago. Of course, I wasn't alive to confirm the date, but it was a long time ago.
Wow.
And this salt deposit that was laid down from this ancient primordial sea, as it evaporated, it left this massive salt deposit that covered all of Utah, probably parts of Colorado, Idaho, Montana, was buried under volcanic activity, and then with heat and pressure was eventually pushed and extruded up. Initially,
Wow.
it would have been at sea level. The deposit now starts about 5,000 feet above sea level as the Great Basin was pushed up in this salt deposit. And the fun thing is eons ago when the dinosaurs were roaming or whatever it was that was there with that seabed, we didn't have the microbeads, we didn't have the plastics, we didn't have the pharmaceuticals that are dumped in some of our oceans today. We didn't have the Japanese nuclear meltdown. We didn't have Exxon Valdez. And so this ancient seabed that was trapped and protected prehistorically with sodium and chloride, but also other trace minerals with it, potassium, calcium, magnesium, was was there and protected when the early pioneers came into the Utah Valley and they watched the animals harvesting the salt. And then
Mhm.
that's how this deposit was known to be there under my grandfather's farm.
Wow. Wow, I love this conversation. Just to imagine that just the geology changing in and of itself is incredible, but to be able to settle onto this salt mine, this awesome space where you can be so helpful to people, that's amazing. Okay, so why salt? Like, why is this important in our daily lives? Because I know that there's a lot of people out there. I've heard family members say, I have too much, or I've not used salt. I have a friend of mine who's in his 80s, and he was like, oh, I haven't had salt in my house for 40 years. So, talk to us about the why. What's the benefits?
Salt is one of the most misunderstood minerals on Earth because for thousands of years it sustained life. It was a source of trade. In fact, every civilization started around access to salt deposits because
Mm.
it was so essential for life and health. You may have heard the phrase, is a man worth his salt?
Mm,
That
yes.
phrase comes because Roman soldiers were actually paid a salary, which is also based on the word saline or sal, a salary in salt because it was valuable ounce for gold. Because if you don't have a refrigerator, you can't preserve food outside of season. And so if you are wanting to preserve any food longer than the shelf life of the actual item, it is preserved in salt. And so it was used universally as trade. You couldn't preserve food with gold, preserve food with salt. And our animals actually need salt to live, just like we do. If you've ever noticed when you go to the hospital, even if you have high blood pressure, water retention, any of these things we've associated with salt, the first thing that's going to happen when you go to the hospital is they're going to give you an IV of saline solution, which is
Right.
salt water. Our tears are salt. Our sweat, if you've ever licked your arm or tasted your tears, they're salt. Our urine is salt. And our blood and our intercellular fluids are also salt. In fact, an IV of distilled water, an IV of coffee or tea, an IV of anything, or even tap water, an IV of anything but saline solution would be disastrous to the body. The cells would start to rupture because our bodies are saline solution in motion. And that's
Mm,
why salt has always been the most important nutrient outside of oxygen and water, which we know we need both of those things to survive.
yes,
The
we do.
next thing we need is salt. It's not food, that's quite a ways down on the list. But water and salt and oxygen are the top three. And that's
Wow.
why salt has always been so important. And you make an
Wow.
interesting point because you have heard, like this neighbor gentleman saying, oh, I heard salt was bad for me. And we saw the same thing with fat. It wasn't that long ago that everything was this low fat craze. And then they started doing some research and realized our eyes need good fats. Our brains are mostly fat. And there's a big difference in processed fat and good, healthy, clean fat, whether it's animal meats or animal proteins or avocados and olives. There's a big difference in fats and there's a big difference in salts. And in the 1950s, and I can send you this for the show notes if you want, but there was
Yeah.
an article published in the 1950s by
Wow.
this Dr. Dow in 1954, and they took 20 times the amount of safe salt and injected it into mice with restricted water content. And sure enough, if you restrict a mouse its ability to have water and you inject it with 20 times the safe amount of salt, my golly, that mouse has some health problems really quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so those initial salt studies were so faulty and biased that
Yeah.
they didn't look at our blood serum and our tears and our sweat and our urine, because our bodies absolutely have to have salt to live. We see this with the military and sports teams sometimes, where you'll have, or even sometimes a radio station will do a water drinking contest, and then somebody actually has died from hyponatremia because water does not hydrate. Water and salt hydrates, but with just water, you'll actually die of hyponatremia, which is low salt, because that saline balance is so important in our bodies.
Wow. And we are in an era where, my goodness, every single child is walking around with some sort of water bottle in their hand, talking about needing to be hydrated. Wow, that just add some salt in there before you go in, and it's probably much better for you. Amazing. Okay, so what's the difference? What's the difference in Redmond salt and perhaps other? I know that there's a lot of people listening that maybe they know about iodized salt, or maybe they know about Himalayan salt, or maybe they know about all kinds of. What's the difference in Redmond?
So I love that question because it's a pretty complex question, and I think the best question for your audience to really remember at the end of this is, how do I find a good salt for me? And there's actually
Mm,
three questions to ask that I will end with after we talk a little bit about the difference. So remind me to talk about the three questions to ask to
okay.
find a great salt.
Okay.
So if we went back before the invention of the refrigerator, all of us would have eaten more salt, because all of
Mm,
our kimchis, our sauerkrauts, our pickles, our fermented veggies, our meats, we would have been preserving everything with salt. And yet, the salt that our ancestors would have been using is quite a bit different from most of the salts on the shelf today. Different in two big aspects. Now, all salt can be defined as sea salt because it comes from a sea bed at some point. It might be a current ocean like the San Francisco Bay or the Gulf of Mexico or the Sea of Japan. It might be from a dead sea like the Dead Sea in Utah called the Great Salt Lake, or the Dead Sea in Israel called the Dead Sea. Or it
mhm.
could be an ancient seabed that has occurred long ago and then was trapped off and contained, which is the Redmond deposit here in Utah, the Himalayan deposit in Nepal and Pakistan, the Bolivian rose deposit in Bolivia. Those are all ancient seabeds, but they're all part of a sea. And so the first question would be, is it from a current ocean or an ancient sea or a dead sea? But when you get the salt, there's two things that can happen. Salt is hygroscopic. That's a word that means basically it's a dehumidifier, hygroscopic. So it sucks water out of the air. So when salt is sitting in a room or in a shaker and it's actively sucking water out of the air, that salt will tend to clump,
Yeah.
because it's getting wet. And so years ago, salt manufacturers came up with this plan and said, what chemicals could we coat this crystal with to stop its ability to interact with moisture?
Ugh.
Like taking a stick of deodorant and rubbing it all over it. And these
Okay.
chemicals are things like sodium silicoaluminate, which is very much the antiperspirant chemical.
Okay.
Or it could be something like sodium ferrocyanide. Sodium, ferrous is iron, and cyanide is poison. But these chemicals can stop the salt's ability to interact with moisture when our body's job, the salt's job in the body, is to regulate intracellular and extracellular fluids. And so they're taking salt's natural biological process and coating it with a chemical designed to stop its ability to do that. That's big problem number one.
Yeah.
Secondly, our oceans occur with sodium, calcium, potassium, iodine, which is why a lot of your seafood and your seaweed and your dulse have high iodine levels, is because the ocean occurs with that. Potassium, magnesium. And salt companies realized around the turn of the century that you could take the seawater, and instead of letting all of that salt water evaporate in one setting and getting a single full spectrum salt, like manufacturers like Celtic and Baja and some of those other good salt manufacturers do today, you could take the water and you can move it into a pond, and with a different liner you could leach off the magnesium. Then you can move it to the next pond and leach off the potassium. Move it to the next pond, leach off the calcium. And now you've got this you've got potassium, calcium, magnesium that you can sell off to other industries. And then you can still sell the sea
Ah,
salt left as a sea salt. And it's not a dietary amount. Nobody's using salt to get their daily amount of iodine or their daily amount of magnesium. But there are salt companies that will take those other high valuable minerals in trace amounts and sell those off. The difference, we have our natural salts, the way our ancestors would have found them, and whether you get that from a current ocean, like the gray salts from France or the red salts from Hawaii, and you're letting that process happen all at once, or you're getting it from an ancient seabed like the deposit in Pakistan or the Himalayas if you live there, or in Bolivia, or here in the US from this ancient seabed in Redmond, but we're not processing it at all. And so that leads me to those last three questions. So whenever you're going to go find a salt, of course, I'm biased. I love the
sure.
salt that comes out of our deposit here in Utah, but there's other good salts out there. I've got some friends that have Himalayan deposits. I've got some that produce great French gray salts. So the first question is, who is producing it? Today, when it comes to salt, food transparency is very difficult. You
Mm.
might go into the store and you might buy a gallon of milk or a dozen eggs, and you might be able to find out, is this an organic valley operation? Was this coming from an Amish farm? When it comes to salt, if you walk into a grocery store and pick up any shaker of salt, to know where the salt came from in that shaker, almost impossible. And
Very
so the
difficult.
first question is, who is producing it? Because if you can know who is actually producing it, then you can ask the second question is, where's the source? Is
Mm.
it from a current ocean? There's some great places in the current ocean. There's some other ones that aren't so great. And it also can be time sensitive. If I was getting my salt from the Gulf of Mexico, I probably wouldn't want to do that, or Gulf of America. I wouldn't want to do that while the BP spill was taking place.
Right.
If I was getting my salt from the coast of Alaska or even further down through California, I wouldn't want to get my salt from there during the Exxon Valdez spill, or the Sea of Japan, or a Mediterranean disaster. And so those are good questions to know. Is the who's producing it? What's the source? And then the final question is, what are they doing to it? Taking anything out, like in those examples before, they've taken out any calcium or potassium or magnesium. Most important, are they putting anything back in?
In.
Are
Yeah.
they adding any of those chemicals that are approved salt additives that interfere with the hygroscopic nature of salt's job in the body? So those are the three questions. And I'd like to think you'd end up with Redmond, but there's other good brands out there. And as long as you ask those three questions, you'll find a great salt. But I think you'll also find great kale and great avocados and great oranges and great meat products. And so it's a
Sure.
good way to be more conscious of what we're putting in our bodies.
And then, uh, oh, I love this. So it is very clear to me that if I'm going to go choose a salt, first of all, I have noticed that I like the type that I can actually grind myself, right? Because I guess I feel as a consumer a little bit more part of the process. So, can you talk a little bit about the grades of what am I trying to say? How fine the salt is, or do you have different grades of size, maybe?
For salt, that's a really insightful question because of a principle of surface area. So
Okay.
when you're grinding pepper, you actually
Mhm.
get fresher pepper because they husk and you grind it and you crack the peppercorn open. With salt, there's no freshness once you crack it.
Okay.
However, salt has four primary sizes. So our largest size that we typically sell in a health food store or grocery store or online, we call it coarse, and it's about the size of a peppercorn, which is a great size for a salt mill. Now, when it comes to salt mills, there's a couple things to keep in mind because salt does interact with some metals if they're not high quality, like a mild steel. So I always recommend, when possible, a ceramic grinder versus a stainless steel grinder because
Got
of
it.
that mechanism. And I
Yeah.
don't recommend plastic because plastic can be ground. The salt can be harder than the plastic mechanism itself.
True.
So the nice part about that size is a lot of the mills today, you can select any other size. So if you want it a little chunkier, you can select that. Or if you want powder, you can select that. So the next size down, we call that size kosher salt. Now, kosher is the size that you might expect to see on a pretzel or on edamame or as a margarita rimmer. That size is known as kosher salt because this is fun
Yeah.
because salt, it's hygroscopic, and in the Jewish community, according to the Torah, blood is not kosher, meaning it's not clean. And because salt will suck moisture and fluids, to make a piece of meat kosher, you cake it with salt that's the right size of particle that will suck blood out of meat without making the meat overly salty. So that size of crystal is known as koshering salt because you can make meat kosher when you use that size of crystal. Now, most chefs, unless you're watching Jewish cooking television, when they say kosher salt, they're not meaning for the Jewish community.
Right.
That koshering crystal will suck blood. It will also dry out a rind. So if you're doing a prime rib, if you kosher it or coat it in kosher salt, it'll suck the juices out. It also
Wow.
has a sweeter flavor because you have less surface area exposed to the tongue. So this would be similar to confectioner's sugar versus a sugar cube or a hardtack candy.
Got it.
I can put a piece of hardtack candy in my mouth and my tongue is only tasting the outside edge of that cube. If I pulverize that hardtack candy into powder and I put that whole thing in my mouth, it's going to be sickening sweet because
Right.
there's so much surface area exposed. So kosher sized is that larger sized crystal. Now, all of our salt is approved for the Jewish community. We have a rabbi that will come through the facility. There's no sacraments, there's no blessings. He just walks through to make sure people are washing their hands just like you would a health inspector, and there's no food particles or other cross contamination that would impact the Jewish law of health. So we do have a kosher sized salt that is kosher certified, and we have a fine sized salt that is also kosher
Kosher
certified.
certified. Fantastic.
Now, the next size down is just, we call it granular or fine. It's the regular table salt size you would just use to table side. It's about the size of granulated sugar or granulated salt, and it's used for kind of everyday cooking. And then
Mm.
final size, we call it powder. Now, you could do this with your grinder if you set it to the finest setting. This size is perfect like you would use confectioner sugar. So if you're doing popcorn or maybe you're doing some sprouted nuts and you're going to
Mhm.
soak them and sprout them, the finer very powdery size will give you a flavor burst that is substantially more than the finer. And that smaller particle will also adhere to chips and popcorn better. So if you sprinkle it on, you'll have less that falls off because of that surface area to grab onto.
Wow, we're learning so much, y'all. This is great. Okay, so let's talk about some case studies. I'm aware that we're coming around to understanding the importance of it. And clearly, what did you say the word was?
Hygroscopic.
High grow with a G. Got it. Hygroscopic. So, for those of us that are a little bit more medically minded that are listening, what are some medical or health benefits and maybe some case studies of people that have used your salt or some signs of change or something that they've seen when they've used Redmond?
Yeah, and I would be glad to send you some fun studies that you could link in the show notes.
Perfect. Perfect.
This is one from Open Heart Magazine from several years ago, and the title says The Wrong White Crystals, Not Salt, but Sugar, is the cause of hypertension and cardiometabolic disease. And
Oh,
it goes into how when you switch to a low salt diet, one of the first things happens is you end up with insulin resistance because of the way that salt works in the body. And there's a study years ago that they took 475 patients, and they found that those with the highest amounts of sodium could fall into the lowest or the highest blood pressure groups, depending on if they were consuming adequate amounts of calcium, potassium, and magnesium, because those other electrolytes interact with sodium so carefully. And so, if it's not the isolation of any one of those individual nutrients, it's that we need all of them in isolation, or sorry, in not isolation,
Not in
because our
ice.
bodies need access abundance of water as well as those electrolytes. In fact, if you look at any studies, no animal will ever overdose on salt, because they will eat salt and then they will drink water, and they will go back and forth. It's also why you can't overdose on salt from an IV in the hospital, even though you're getting more than the daily recommended allowance of sodium in that IV solution. It's because it's balanced with the body's ability to process that.
And I guess that's it right there, is that you mentioned it earlier, that the very first thing that they do is put you on an IV of saline solution when you get it to the hospital. Come on, guys. Wonderful. Okay, fantastic. Have you noticed that your family has been around this, right? So do you have people that have been working or consuming this Redmond salt specifically that have seen good results from
Yeah,
just being around it?
apparently it doesn't help with hair regrowth. No, great question. And we do have a lot of healthcare practitioners that give a whole list of things that they find when they have their clients move over to our product. I
Mm,
have to be a little careful there because I don't
sure,
want to be accused of practicing medicine.
sure.
But when you switch over to a good, clean salt, you really can't overdose if it's in its natural form, with a
Mm,
couple caveats. If you were eating out of boxes and cans and a lot of processed foods, you probably are getting adequate amounts of sodium. However, for somebody that's switching over to a more natural diet and you're cooking at home, you actually have to go out of your way to add good, healthy salt to your diet, which is
mm.
what they're going to do for you in the hospital by giving you an IV solution to make sure you're getting those adequate amounts of nutrients. You just can't get it from just water. To come full circle, you talked about all of the kids today, which I am so glad our kids today are walking around with water bottles in hands. As
Sure.
a kid, I remember those 52-ounce super big,
Oh,
deluxe
yeah.
gulps, and
Yeah.
just clear full of sugar water.
Yeah.
But if it's just water, they're missing out. And so, fortunately, if you're a parent or maybe you're an athlete yourself, one of the best ways you can make your own sports drink at home is to take a quart of good, clean water and then add a quarter teaspoon of real salt from Redmond or another natural salt, a quarter teaspoon per quart, a squeeze of lemon. You could do a little bit of honey or fig syrup or something if you needed some sweetener, but that'll be pennies on the dollar, and you can make it at home without any of the food coloring, any of the flavors, any of the stuff that's maybe a little more questionable. Now,
Right.
we happen to make something very similar to that. We call it Relight, and it's our electrolytes. We add because people don't eat enough potassium and magnesium, we do add a little potassium and magnesium in addition to our salt that has trace amounts of those. This one happens to be lemon lime flavored, but that's a way you can have that sports drink without having to
Mhm.
make it at home and without having to go to all the artificial stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it is so important. And I think that the great thing that I was just talking to somebody else about this the other day at a festival, that this younger generation seems to be so much more interested in taking care of themselves. The decline in alcohol sales, the decline in some of this, the awareness of what processed food does to you. I think that all of those things are very important. And I think that people are going to really enjoy this podcast because this is really fantastic information that most people just don't get. Okay, I have another question for you. Let's dream a little bit. And this is from Daryl's point of view, right? So, the future of healthcare. Share some of your hopes and your aspirations about where you think the future of healthcare could benefit us most when it's coming to a more preventative and root cause perspective.
That's a powerful question.
Yeah, I love it.
We started, I think before we recorded, we talked about headaches and dehydration and
Mm,
water. Years ago, there was a book written. It was called Your Body's Many Cries for Water. And there
mm,
was a follow-up book called You're Not Sick, You're Thirsty. And I think, not to be overly simplistic, but I think with humans, we have sometimes gotten so far down the processed food route that we don't stop to think what our body's made of. Our bodies are 72% water, which means outside of a spiritual discussion, if I'm 72% water and the rest of me is minerals, I'm about 42 pounds of minerals every day. And I'm 72% water. So I have to go out of my way every day to make sure I'm hydrated. And with hydration, some of the first signs of dehydration, irritability,
mm,
restless legs, fatigue, dizzy when standing, all of these things that most of us might feel every day, or a headache. And so instead of reaching for the ibuprofen or the next thing, stopping and reaching for a glass of water and putting a little bit of salt.
mm,
Salt, if it's a clean natural salt, will actually taste sweet, not salty, on that first taste. Now, that
mm.
piece I just put in my mouth, it was almost like candy, which means I probably should put 4 or 5 more in. Eventually, that's not going to taste very good, because my body, just like that first glass of water after a long run is amazing, the fifth glass isn't so much. When it comes to hydration and minerals, it's really important that it's not like a once a day thing. To drink all of your water before bedtime doesn't do what it could do if you're drinking water throughout the day, and
Right.
maintaining that hydration level. And then I would just add, I think it'll be really fun, maybe scary, to see what AI does for health and wellness
Mm,
with the idea of immediate feedback. Imagine taking a glass of water and then in your glasses, you see this little energy bar that says, "Oh, you can see it going from green down to yellow, down to red." That would be fascinating and really
wow.
powerful. And then
Yeah,
if you ate a big candy bar, because we have our cheat moments, and you
sure.
see this little health screen pop up in the rim of your glasses that says, uh, warning, you realize you've just spiked your insulin like more than that. Instant feedback on diet, my gosh, that would be
Yeah.
helpful.
I had never really thought about that. That's true. That's true. That's very true.
It might be annoying, but it also would be very helpful.
Yes, it's the burden of knowledge, right? Once we learn something and you can't necessarily unlearn it. This has just been amazing. Listeners, we are going to put all the show notes down in the bottom. We are going to make sure that you know where you can get your Redmond salt by linking Redmond, and come to Changing Life and Destiny if this is something that you're listening to before April of 2026, because Redmond will be there and you can learn even more about this amazing product that can be so helpful to your health and well-being. So, Darryl, thank you so much for being here today. Your story and your energy is palpable through the machine that I'm standing in front of.
Thank you for having me on. It was a real pleasure. I look forward to meeting you in person, but thank you very much.
Absolutely. Have a great day. That's a wrap for today's episode of the Change Life Destiny podcast. If you loved what you heard, share it with a friend and follow us for more bold conversations and breakthrough ideas. Ready to take the next step? Visit changelifedestiny.com to join the movement. See you next time, and keep diving in, learning, and leading the change.